declared dead. Her family wept, and the coffin was lowered into the ground. But that night, faint cries rose from beneath the earth. What they discovered still haunts the village of 1889. The year was 1889, a time when science and medicine were far from what we know today. In a quiet European village, death was an all-too-common visitor, and misdiagnoses were frighteningly frequent. Doctors had no modern machines, no precise instruments, just their eyes, their hands, and their guesses. It was in this uncertain world that a tragedy unfolded. A young girl, no older than 17, fell suddenly ill. Her family described her as vibrant, full of laughter just days before. But a sudden fever overtook her, and within hours she collapsed into unconsciousness. The village doctor arrived, his lantern flickering in the dimly lit bedroom. He checked her breathing, pressed his ear against her chest, and then, with a heavy sigh, shook his head. "She is gone," he whispered to her devastated parents. The mother cried out in disbelief, clutching her daughter's hand, begging for her to wake. But the girl lay motionless, pale, and cold. In those days, there was no second opinion, no long wait to confirm. Death was declared, and burials often took place within hours, sometimes the very same day. Out of fear of disease and decay, families had no choice but to let go quickly. Her coffin was built by the village carpenter, a simple wooden box. Neighbors gathered to mourn as the church bells tolled. Candles flickered around the coffin, their flames reflecting in the tears of the grieving. Her younger brother, barely 12, stood silent, unable to believe that his sister, his closest companion, would never return. The funeral was heavy with sorrow. The priest read prayers as the coffin was lowered into the freshly dug earth. Soil struck the wood with hollow thuds, each sound breaking the family's hearts further. One by one, they turned away, whispering final goodbyes. To them, it was the end of her story. But the village would soon learn. It was not. For beneath the earth, inside the sealed darkness, her story was just beginning. Night fell over the small village. The church bells that had rung earlier were now silent, and only the wind moved through the narrow cobblestone streets. Families locked their doors, whispered prayers, and settled into uneasy sleep. But at the edge of the graveyard, silence did not last long. Hours after the girl's coffin had been lowered into the earth, something strange began. At first, it was so faint that no one would have believed it. A muffled thump, like soil shifting against wood. The cemetery groundskeeper, an old man with sharp hearing, thought it was the wind or perhaps his weary mind playing tricks. But then came another sound. A cry. Weak, desperate, barely human, yet impossible to ignore. He froze, his lantern trembling in his hand. He leaned closer to the grave. The sound grew clearer, faint sobs, scratching, and the unmistakable pounding of fists against wood. The groundskeeper dropped his lantern, racing back to the village. He banged on doors, his voice breaking the midnight calm. "She's alive. The girl in the grave, she's alive." Villagers poured into the street, confused, frightened. Some accused the old man of madness. Others whispered of ghosts, curses, or demons. But a few, holding lanterns high, followed him back to the graveyard. The moment they reached the site, silence swallowed the group. Then, once again, a muffled cry rose from beneath the earth. Gasps spread through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children. Men exchanged fearful glances. The priest whispered, "God have mercy." No one knew what to do. Fear kept them frozen, fear of being wrong, of disturbing the dead, of digging up what they should not. But the sounds grew louder, more desperate. Whoever or whatever was down there was fighting to live. Finally, one villager, trembling with resolve, grabbed a shovel. He struck the earth. Others joined in, their fear outweighed by the urgency of the cries. Soil flew, lanterns flickered, and sweat poured down their faces as they dug frantically. Then, At last the shovel struck wood. The coffin. Silence followed. The crowd held its breath. Slowly, carefully, they pried open the lid. And inside, the girl's eyes were open. She was alive. Her lips trembled as she whispered a single word, "Help." The graveyard erupted in shouts of shock and prayers of relief. But for many, the moment was not one of joy, it was one of horror. For they had buried her once, and the question now lingered, what if she had never cried out? The villagers stood frozen, their lanterns casting trembling light over the coffin. The young girl's pale face looked back at them, her eyes glassy with exhaustion, her lips cracked and dry. She tried to sit up, but her body was weak, starved of air. Her mother collapsed in tears, crying out her daughter's name, reaching into the coffin to cradle her. The father, stunned and pale, staggered backward, unable to believe what he was seeing. Just hours ago, he had buried his child, now she was alive in his arms. But joy was not the only emotion that filled the graveyard. Fear rippled through the crowd. Some whispered that it was a miracle. Others, with trembling voices, claimed it was a curse. Superstitions ran deep in 1889. For some, the thought of someone returning from a grave seemed unnatural, unholy. The priest stepped forward, clutching his cross tightly. He whispered prayers, his voice shaking as he tried to calm both the girl and the panicked villagers. "She lives," he declared. "By God's mercy, she has been spared." The girl, though barely conscious, managed to whisper between gasps of air. She spoke of the coffin's suffocating darkness, of waking up trapped, unable to move or breathe, of pounding on the lid until her strength nearly failed her. Her words sent shivers down every spine. The villagers carried her back to her family's home, wrapping her in blankets and lighting every candle they could find. The doctor who had declared her dead was summoned. When he saw her, his face drained of color. He touched her wrist, felt her pulse, and trembled with shame. He had been wrong. But the girl's return did not silence the unease. Rumors began to spread across the village. Some said she had crossed into death and returned. Others claimed she had never truly died, but her spirit had been caught between worlds. A few even whispered that it was a sign of worse things to come. As she lay weak but breathing in her bed, the village faced a haunting truth. In a time before modern medicine, the line between life and death was thinner than they had ever imagined. And the girl, though rescued, would never forget the sound of soil falling against her coffin lid, sealing her into darkness. The days after her rescue were filled with both relief and unease. The young girl lay in her small wooden bed, wrapped in blankets, her chest rising and falling in slow, fragile breaths. Her family never left her side, terrified that if they turned away, she might slip into silence again. But outside that home, the village had become restless. Some called her survival a miracle, a blessing from God that should be celebrated. They brought food, gifts, and prayers, insisting she was chosen for something greater. Others, however, whispered that she had crossed into death and returned with something unholy clinging to her soul. The priest urged calm, reminding the villagers that life and death were mysteries only God could decide. But his words did little to quiet the fearful whispers. At night, when the streets grew dark, people spoke of curses, of spirits, of omens. Some refused to walk near the girl's home, crossing themselves whenever they passed by. The girl herself was caught between gratitude and terror. She clung to her mother, waking often in the night screaming from nightmares, of soil pressing against her chest, of suffocating darkness closing in. She could still hear, in her mind, the muffled thud of earth striking her coffin lid. Even in the warmth of her home, she felt the cold weight of the grave. One evening, as the family sat by candlelight, a knock came at the door. It was the doctor, the same man who had declared her dead. His hands trembled as he apologized, his voice breaking with guilt. He explained that faint pulses could be missed, that sometimes fainting spells resembled death, but his words brought little comfort. For the family, his mistake had nearly cost them everything. Still, the girl slowly regained strength. Her color returned, her voice grew steadier, though her eyes often drifted to the window, fearful of the cemetery that loomed in the distance. And though she lived, her story spread far beyond the village. Travelers carried the tale to neighboring towns, where people debated whether it was a miracle, a curse, or a chilling reminder of how fragile life truly was. In the year 1889, medicine had no answers. The villagers could only cling to their faith, their fears, and the haunting memory of a girl who had been buried alive and clawed her way back to the living. Weeks passed, and the girl's strength slowly returned. Her cheeks regained their color, her voice no longer trembled, and the faint shadow of death that once clung to her seemed to fade away. But the fear in the village did not. Wherever she walked, whispers followed. Children stared with wide eyes, some in awe, others in terror, as if they were seeing a ghost move among them. Old women crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. To many, she was no longer simply a child, she was a symbol, proof that the line between life and death was not as clear as they had always believed. Her parents tried to shield her from the gossip. They reminded her that she was alive, and that was all that mattered. But the girl herself could not forget. At night, she still woke up drenched in sweat, clutching her chest, feeling again the crushing weight of soil pressing down on her coffin. Each breath she took seemed borrowed, a fragile gift that could vanish without warning. And yet, life demanded to move forward. She returned to her daily chores, helped her mother with sewing, fetched water from the well. But even in these simple tasks, there was always someone watching, whispering. Some villagers came to touch her hand, believing her survival gave her healing powers. Others avoided her entirely, afraid she carried death within her. One day, as she walked with her father past the churchyard, she stopped, staring at the rows of graves. Somewhere beneath that earth was the hole where she had once been buried. The place that was supposed to be her eternal rest, but had instead become the setting of her nightmare. She shivered, clutching her father's hand tighter. Her father, voice steady, told her, "You have been given a second life. Do not let fear steal it from you." His words sank deep into her heart. For the first time, she began to believe that survival was not a curse, but a chance. By the end of the year, the story of the girl who rose from the grave had traveled far beyond the village. Newspapers carried whispers of it, travelers retold it in taverns, and strangers came to catch a glimpse of her. Some called her a miracle, others a warning. But for the girl herself, the truth was simpler. She had faced death, and somehow she had lived. That alone made every sunrise, every breath, every laugh with her family more precious than she could ever explain. Her name might be lost to history, but her story lived on as a haunting reminder of the fragile line between life and death, and of the chance twist of fate that saved a little girl from being forgotten in the dark earth of 1889. The year was 1889, when a child's life was stolen and returned in the same breath. And though decades have passed, her story still lingers, whispered like a legend across time. For the girl, survival was never something ordinary. It was a shadow she carried always. Even as she grew older, she would sometimes pause at the sound of church bells, her heart trembling as if to remind her of that coffin, that suffocating darkness. Yet with every fear came a new strength, the knowledge that life, once nearly lost, was now too precious to waste. In the village, her tale became a warning parents told their children at night. Never lose hope, for even in the grave, miracles can happen. Some believed her rescue was a gift from God. Others insisted it was sheer luck. But none could deny that her survival had shaken their beliefs about life, death, and destiny. Years later, when strangers visited the village, they would ask, Where is the girl who returned from the grave? And though her face had aged, her story made her timeless. She lived quietly, away from fame, yet she carried within her a secret far greater than any recognition. She had seen what no child should see. She had felt the cold hand of death and returned. And in that return, she carried a message not in words, but in the way she lived. Every smile, every touch of kindness, every moment with her family was a declaration that life, no matter how fragile, was worth holding on to. Her name faded from memory, lost to the dust of history, but her story endured. A reminder that sometimes fate bends, that miracles can happen, and that even in the darkest earth, hope has the power to breathe again. The girl buried alive, who walked back into the light.
Thanks you for watch. Every old story holds a lesson worth remembering. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for watch and listen more old times real stories, and don't forget,